The crack of a whip silenced the rowdy crowd gathered in the dusty square of Hot Springs, Arkansas. As Jessica Fuller stood trembling on the auction block, her tattered dress revealing more of her sun-kissed skin than she'd ever willingly show in public. It was 1875, a time when the West was still wild and opportunities for women were as scarce as water in a desert. At 22, Jessica never imagined she'd be sold like cattle to settle her late father's gambling debts. $5 for the girl, shouted a greasy-haired man with tobacco-stained teeth, his eyes roaming over Jessica's form with unhidden lust. 10, called another. 15 and she'll warm my bed tonight, hollered a third, eliciting raucous laughter from the crowd. Tears burned in Jessica's eyes as she stared at the ground, shame washing over her in waves. Her father's death 3 months prior had left her alone and vulnerable in a world that showed little mercy to women without protection. Their small homestead had been seized along with everything she'd ever owned, save for the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket clutched tightly in her palm. $25, a voice rang out, deeper and steadier than the others. Jessica lifted her gaze to see a tall man at the back of the crowd. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't lecherous or mocking. He stood straight-backed, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest, his face partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Something in his stance commanded respect, causing the crowd to part slightly as he stepped forward. $30 for the lady, he continued, his voice carrying across the now quieting square. The auctioneer, a portly man with a greedy gleam in his eye, grinned. $30 from Mr. Donovan. Do I hear 35, $50? The tobacco-stained man spat on the ground. $100, the stranger countered without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. $100 was a small fortune in these parts, going once. The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement. Going twice. Sold. To Mr. Matthew Donovan for $100. Jessica's heart hammered against her ribs as Matthew Donovan approached the auction block, his spurs jingling with each step. Up close, she could see his features clearly, strong jawline covered in a neatly trimmed beard, piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her, and a small scar that ran along his right cheekbone. He paid the auctioneer, then turned to Jessica, his expression unreadable. She braced herself, wondering what kind of man would pay such a sum for a woman he didn't know. Whatever his intentions, they couldn't be honorable. To her surprise, Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of blue ribbon. With gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, he tied the ribbon around her wrist, a stark contrast to the rope that had bound her hands earlier. "Miss Fuller," he said quietly, offering his hand to help her down from the platform. "I believe every person deserves their dignity." The simple gesture, the ribbon, the use of her proper name, the gentle hand offered in assistance rather than grabbing at her brought fresh tears to Jessica's eyes, but these were different from before. He led her away from the jeering crowd, away from the humiliation of the auction block. "Why?" she managed to whisper once they were beyond earshot of the others. Matthew Donovan turned to her, the sun catching the gold flecks in his blue eyes, and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Because no one deserves to be treated as less than human, Miss Fuller, not even in times like these." It was in that moment, with a blue ribbon around her wrist and the first genuine smile she'd seen in months directed at her, that Jessica Fuller felt something she thought had died with her father, hope. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Donovan," Jessica said as they walked away from the town square. "There's no need for thanks," Matthew replied, "and please call me Matthew." They reached a modest wagon hitched to 2 chestnut horses at the edge of town. Jessica noticed a small D branded on the side the Donovan mark. She presumed. "I own a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside of town," Matthew explained, helping her onto the wagon seat. "It's not much, but there's a small cabin on the property where you can stay until you decide what you want to do next." Jessica stared at him, confused. "You're not expecting me to?" Matthew's expression grew serious. "Miss Fuller, I bought your contract to free you from it, not to enforce it. You're not bound to me or anyone else. The cabin is yours to use for as long as you need, and when you're ready to move on, I'll provide you with enough money to start fresh somewhere else." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Jessica asked, clutching her mother's locket tighter. Matthew clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. "I've seen enough injustice in this world to last several lifetimes. Sometimes a small kindness is all we can offer against the tide of cruelty." As the wagon rumbled out of Hot Springs, Jessica studied her rescuer's profile. There was something haunted in his eyes, a sadness that seemed to match her own. Whatever demons Matthew Donovan was fighting, they had led him to save her, and for that she was grateful. The ride to the Donovan ranch passed mostly in silence, with Jessica taking in the rolling hills and pine forests that gradually gave way to open pastures. Cattle dotted the landscape, their lazy forms moving slowly in the late afternoon sun. "It's beautiful," she murmured, breaking the silence. Matthew nodded. "My father staked this claim 20 years ago. Started with 10 head of cattle and built it up to over 300 before he passed. Been trying to keep it going these past 5 years on my own." "No family to help?" Jessica asked, then immediately regretted her boldness. "I apologize, that's none of my business." "No need to apologize. Truth is, it's just me. My mother died when I was young and my father never remarried. I had a younger brother, but he—" Matthew's voice trailed off, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the reins tighter. "He was killed during the war," Jessica nodded, understanding all too well the pain of loss. "My mother died of fever when I was 12. It was just my father and me until 3 months ago. Consumption took him." "I'm sorry to hear that," Matthew said sincerely. The wagon crested a hill, revealing a modest but well-maintained ranch house surrounded by several outbuildings. A large barn stood to one side, and a small cabin was visible about 100 yards from the main house. "That's the cabin I mentioned," Matthew pointed. "It used to be the foreman's quarters, but I haven't had a foreman in a couple of years. It's simple, but it's clean and private." As they pulled up to the cabin, Jessica noticed smoke rising from the chimney. "Is someone there?" Matthew smiled. "That would be Mrs. Wilkins. She comes to help with the cooking and cleaning a few days a week. I sent word ahead with one of my ranch hands to have her prepare the cabin. She's probably left some supper for you as well." The thought of a hot meal made Jessica's stomach growl audibly, causing her to blush with embarrassment. Matthew pretended not to notice as he helped her down from the wagon. The cabin was indeed small but immaculately clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, warming the single room. A bed with fresh linen stood in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs in another, and a few shelves held basic cooking utensils. A steaming pot hung over the fire, filling the air with the savory aroma of beef stew. "There's a washroom out back," Matthew explained, indicating a path visible through the small window. "And Mrs. Wilkins left some clothes for you on the bed. They were my mother's, but she was about your size, I think." Jessica's throat tightened with emotion. "Mr. Donovan, Matthew, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll eat that stew before it gets cold," he replied with a gentle smile. "And get some rest. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, Mrs. Wilkins could use some help with the mending and preserving. She's getting on in years, and her eyes aren't what they used to be." "Of course," Jessica agreed quickly, eager to be useful. I'm quite skilled with a needle, and my preserves won ribbons at the county fair 2 years running. Matthew's smile widened. Then you'll be a welcome addition indeed. I'll leave you to your supper. If you need anything, just give a shout. The main house isn't far. After Matthew left, Jessica sank onto one of the wooden chairs, overwhelmed by the day's events. That morning, she'd been dragged to an auction block, expecting to be sold into a life of servitude or worse. Now, she sat in a clean cabin with a hot meal before her, wearing a blue ribbon that symbolized not ownership, but freedom. She ran her fingers over the smooth satin of the ribbon, still tied loosely around her wrist. It was such a small thing, yet it had been the first gesture of kindness she'd received in months. And that smile genuine, warm, without a trace of the cruelty or pity she'd grown accustomed to seeing. After savoring every bite of the rich stew, Jessica explored her new temporary home. On the bed, she found a simple cotton nightgown, 2 dresses, 1 blue calico and 1 brown homespun, a shawl, and undergarments. All were modest but well made, and though slightly dated in style, they were in good condition. She took the opportunity to wash with the basin of water left by Mrs. Wilkins, scrubbing away the grime and humiliation of the auction block. As she changed into the nightgown, she felt almost human again. Before climbing into bed, Jessica untied the ribbon from her wrist and carefully folded it, placing it on the small table next to her mother's locket. These 2 small tokens, one a reminder of the family she'd lost, the other a symbol of unexpected kindness, were now her most precious possessions. That night, for the first time since her father's death, Jessica slept without fear. The following morning, Jessica woke to birds singing and sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in the blue calico, which fit her surprisingly well, and stepped outside. The ranch was already bustling with activity. Cowboys moved among the cattle in the distance, their shapes small against the vast pasture. Closer to the main house, a woman who must be Mrs. Wilkins was hanging laundry on a line. Jessica made her way toward her, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "Good morning. You must be Mrs. Wilkins. I'm Jessica Fuller." The older woman turned, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Well, good morning to you, Miss Fuller. I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you. And the stew was delicious." Mrs. Wilkins waved away the compliment. "Just a simple recipe. Now, Mr. Donovan tells me you're handy with a needle and know your way around a kitchen. That's a blessing, because these cowboys tear through their clothes something fierce, and I've got jars of peaches that need putting up before they spoil." Jessica spent the morning helping Mrs. Wilkins with the household chores, grateful for the familiar routine. The older woman was kind but forthright, sharing stories about the ranch and its owner that painted a picture of a hard-working, honorable man who demanded much of himself and little of others. "Been with the Donovans since before Matthew was born," Mrs. Wilkins said as they worked side by side, peeling peaches for preserves. "His father, God rest his soul, was a good man but stern. Matthew takes after him in many ways, but he's got his mother's gentle heart. He certainly showed me kindness when I needed it most," Jessica admitted. Mrs. Wilkins nodded knowingly. "That auction business is a disgrace. Not the first time something like that's happened in Hot Springs, mind you, but usually it's the saloon owner or the mine foreman buying up contracts. Never known Matthew to involve himself in such matters before." Jessica felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure he would have helped anyone in my situation." "Perhaps," Mrs. Wilkins conceded, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "Either way, you're here now, and an extra pair of hands is always welcome, especially ones that know what they're doing." Around midday, Matthew returned to the house for dinner, the main meal served at noon on the ranch. Jessica found herself oddly nervous as she helped Mrs. Wilkins set the large kitchen table. He entered with two other men, ranch hands who tipped their hats politely to Jessica before washing up at the basin by the door. Matthew followed suit, rolling up his sleeves to reveal strong forearms tanned by the sun. "Miss Fuller," he greeted her with a nod. "I hope you're settling in all right." "Very well, thank you," she replied, conscious of the other men's curious glances. "Mrs. Wilkins has been most kind." "Kind, my foot," the older woman snorted good-naturedly. "I've been working this poor girl to the bone. But she's fixed that tear in your Sunday shirt so neatly you'd never know it was there, Matthew." Dinner was a simple affair: roast beef, potatoes, and the last of the previous summer's preserved vegetables, but the conversation flowed easily. The ranch hands, introduced as Tom and Hank, were respectful but friendly, including Jessica in their talk about the cattle and local news. Matthew spoke little, but Jessica often caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When their eyes met, he would offer a small smile before returning his attention to his plate. After the meal, as Jessica helped clear the dishes, Matthew approached her. "I'm riding into town this afternoon for supplies. I wondered if there might be anything you need." Jessica thought of her meager possessions: the clothes on her back, her mother's locket, and the blue ribbon Matthew had given her. "You've already been too generous, but perhaps some thread. I noticed several items that need mending and your current supply is limited." "Thread," Matthew repeated with a nod. "Any particular color?" The question was so ordinary, so domestic, that it caught Jessica off guard. Here was a man who had spent $100 to save her from auction, concerned about what color thread she might prefer. "Blue, if possible," she answered, thinking of the ribbon still carefully folded by her bedside. "And perhaps some white." Matthew nodded again. "Blue and white thread. Anything else? A book, perhaps? I noticed you looking at my father's bookshelf earlier." Jessica hadn't realized he'd seen her admiring the small collection in the main house. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition. Reading material is scarce out here and the nights can be long." "Then yes, a book would be wonderful. Anything, really. I'm not particular." Matthew's smile reached his eyes this time. "I'll see what Mr. Peterson at the general store has available. He keeps a small lending library of sorts." As Matthew prepared to leave for town, Jessica returned to the cabin to fetch a shawl, the afternoon having turned cooler. On impulse, she picked up the blue ribbon from the table and slipped it into her pocket. When she reached the main house again, Matthew was already mounted on his horse, a handsome bay gelding with a white blaze down its face. "I almost forgot," Jessica called, approaching the horse. She pulled the ribbon from her pocket and reached up, tying it carefully around the horse's bridle. "For luck," she explained, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Matthew looked at the ribbon, then at Jessica, his expression softening. "Thank you, Miss Fuller." "Jessica," she corrected him gently. "If I'm to call you Matthew, then you must call me Jessica." He inclined his head. "Jessica," he repeated, her name sounding different somehow when he said it. "I'll be back before dark." As he rode away, Jessica felt Mrs. Wilkins's knowing gaze on her back. "Just being friendly," she said defensively, turning to face the older woman. Mrs. Wilkins raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say a word, dear." But her smile said plenty. The days fell into a rhythm at the Donovan ranch. Jessica helped Mrs. Wilkins with the household tasks during the day and returned to her cabin in the evenings, often with a book borrowed from Matthew's collection. He'd brought back 3 from town that first day, a volume of poetry by Tennyson, a dog-eared copy of David Copperfield, and a practical guide to Western plants and their uses. Matthew himself remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite and kind, but also reserved. He spent long days working with the cattle or mending fences, returning tired but always taking time to ask about Jessica's day. Sometimes in the evenings, he would sit on the porch of the main house, and Jessica would join him, the two of them watching the sunset in companionable silence. A week after her arrival, Jessica found him there, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude on his solitude. "Join me," he invited. Noticing her standing at the edge of the porch, Jessica settled into the chair beside him. "What are you making?" Matthew turned the piece of wood in his hands. "Not sure yet. Sometimes I just let the knife decide." They sat quietly for a while, the only sounds the scrape of Matthew's knife against the wood and the distant lowing of cattle. "May I ask you something?" Jessica finally broke the silence. Matthew set down his whittling. "Of course. Why did you really buy my contract? And please don't say it was just a random act of kindness. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you've never done anything like that before." Matthew was quiet for so long that Jessica thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and reflective. "I was in town that day to meet with the bank about a loan. The cattle market's been unpredictable, and I needed to secure funds for the winter." He paused, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood in his hands. "I heard the commotion in the square and went to see what was happening. When I saw you standing there trying to maintain your dignity despite everything." He shook his head. "You reminded me of someone." "Who?" Jessica asked softly. "My mother," Matthew replied. "Not in looks, but in spirit. She had that same proud set to her shoulders, even when things were at their worst." He looked at Jessica directly now. "The year before she died, there was a drought. We lost half the herd, and my father had to take work at the silver mine to make ends meet. Some of the townspeople who'd broken bread at our table started treating her differently, like our misfortune was somehow catching." Jessica nodded, understanding all too well how quickly people could turn when circumstances changed. "One Sunday at church," Matthew continued, "I overheard Mrs. Peterson, the general store owner's wife, suggest that perhaps my mother should consider selling some of her personal items if things were so dire. Her wedding ring, specifically." His jaw tightened at the memory. "My mother just smiled and said she'd rather sell her soul to the devil than part with the symbol of her marriage vows. She walked out with her head held high, same as you tried to do on that auction block." "What happened then?" Jessica asked. "The rains came 2 days later. The cattle survived, my father came home from the mines, and life went on. But I never forgot the look on my mother's face that day, hurt but defiant." Matthew's voice grew quieter. "She died the following spring. Fever, same as your mother." Jessica reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry." Matthew turned his hand to clasp hers briefly before letting go. "It was a long time ago, but when I saw you at that auction, I couldn't walk away." The honesty of his answer touched Jessica deeply. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "I've never been much good at lying," Matthew admitted with a small smile. "My father used to say my face gives me away every time." Jessica returned his smile. "That's not a bad quality in a man." As twilight deepened around them, Jessica felt a shift in the air between them, a new understanding, a foundation of trust being laid stone by stone. The summer days grew longer and hotter as June turned to July. Jessica found herself feeling more at home on the Donovan ranch than she ever expected. Mrs. Wilkins had taken to coming only 3 days a week, leaving Jessica in charge of the household on the other days, a responsibility she took pride in. Matthew, too, seemed to be emerging from his shell. He began joining her more regularly in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud from one of his books while she mended. other times just talking about the day's work or memories of happier times. One particularly sweltering afternoon, Jessica was hanging laundry when she noticed a cloud of dust in the distance. Riders were approaching, 3 of them, moving fast. Matthew, who had been checking fence lines nearby, also spotted them. He jogged over to where Jessica stood, his expression concerned. "Trouble?" she asked, shading her eyes to see better. "Not sure," he replied. "But unexpected visitors rarely bring good news. Wait inside, please." Jessica nodded and retreated to the main house, but she watched through the window as the riders approached. They were rough-looking men, trail-worn and hard-eyed. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his neck, dismounted first. Though she couldn't hear the conversation, Jessica could see Matthew's posture grow increasingly tense. When one of the men gestured toward the house, Matthew shook his head firmly, stepping between the rider and the building where Jessica hid. The standoff lasted only a minute before the men mounted up again and rode away, but not before the leader spat on the ground at Matthew's feet. Matthew watched them go, waiting until they were out of sight before heading toward the house. "Who were they?" Jessica asked as soon as he entered. Matthew's expression was grim. "Trouble, just as you guessed. They work for James Blackwell, a rancher with land to the north. He's been trying to buy me out for years, and his tactics get less friendly each time. What did they want today? Same as always, to convince me to sell." But there was something else this time. Matthew hesitated. "They'd heard about you." Jessica felt a chill despite the day's heat. "Me? How? News travels fast, even out here. Apparently, my purchasing your contract has become something of a story in Hot Springs." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Jessica had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "Blackwell's men made some insinuations about why I might have bought a woman at auction." Jessica's cheeks burned with renewed humiliation. "They think I'm your—" "It doesn't matter what they think," Matthew cut in firmly. "But it does concern me that Blackwell is showing interest in my personal affairs. He's not a man who acts without purpose." "Should we be worried?" Matthew considered the question. "Cautious, yes. Worried, not yet. I've dealt with Blackwell's intimidation before. But perhaps it would be best if you didn't wander too far from the house alone for a while." Jessica nodded, though the thought of being confined after finally gaining her freedom chafed. "I understand." That evening, Matthew brought out a small wooden box Jessica hadn't seen before. "I think it's time you had this," he said, placing it on the table between them. Inside was a small revolver, its handle inlaid with pearl. "It was my mother's," Matthew explained. "My father gave it to her for protection when he had to be away from the ranch." "I've never fired a gun," Jessica admitted, touching the weapon hesitantly. "Then it's time you learned." Matthew's tone was gentle but firm. "I hope you'll never need to use it, but I'd rest easier knowing you could protect yourself if necessary." The next morning, Matthew took Jessica behind the barn where he'd set up several empty bottles on a fence post. Patiently, he showed her how to load the revolver, how to hold it steady, and how to aim. "Take a breath," he instructed, standing close behind her. "Let half of it out, then squeeze the trigger gently, don't pull it." Jessica concentrated, acutely aware of Matthew's presence just inches away, his hand occasionally guiding hers to adjust her grip or stance. When she finally hit one of the bottles, sending glass shattering, she let out a triumphant laugh. "Well done," Matthew praised, his smile genuine. "A few more practice sessions, and you'll be a regular Annie Oakley." "I doubt that," Jessica replied, but she couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. There was something empowering about knowing she could defend herself if needed. As they walked back to the house, Matthew's hand brushed against hers, possibly by accident, though Jessica wasn't entirely sure. The brief contact sent a flutter through her stomach that she tried to ignore. Whatever was growing between them, friendship, certainly, but perhaps something more was complicated by the circumstances of their meeting. Jessica was still technically in Matthew's employ, living on his property, dependent on his protection. Until she could stand fully on her own 2 feet, she couldn't trust her feelings or his. But in moments like these, with the summer sun warming their shoulders and their hands occasionally brushing as they walked side by side, such practical considerations seemed to fade away. The threat posed by James Blackwell receded from immediate concern as July turned to August without further incident. Life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm, with cattle to tend, meals to prepare, and endless small repairs to be made before winter arrived. Jessica found herself looking forward to each day more than she would have thought possible when she first arrived. She'd started a small vegetable garden behind her cabin, taken over most of the cooking duties from Mrs. Wilkins, and even learned to ride one of the gentler horses Matthew kept for ranch work. It was on one of these riding lessons, with Matthew showing her how to guide the horse using pressure from her knees rather than the reins, that disaster nearly struck. They were in the eastern pasture, far enough from the main house that they couldn't see its roof over the rolling hills. "You're a natural," Matthew called as Jessica successfully navigated the mare around a series of obstacles he'd set up. "Try the figure-8 pattern now." Jessica was halfway through the maneuver when a rattlesnake, disturbed by the horse's hooves, coiled and struck. The mare reared in panic, throwing Jessica from the saddle. She landed hard, the wind knocked from her lungs as the horse bolted away. "Jessica." Matthew was off his horse and at her side in an instant. "Don't move. Are you hurt?" Jessica tried to catch her breath, mentally assessing the damage. "I don't think so, just winded." Matthew's hands moved carefully over her arms and legs, checking for injuries. "Nothing seems broken." "Can you sit up?" With his help, Jessica managed to right herself, wincing at the soreness already setting into her muscles. "The snake? Gone, thankfully, but we need to get you back to the house." Matthew looked around for his horse, which had followed the mare's lead and was now grazing some distance away. "Stay here, I'll get him." As Matthew walked toward his horse, whistling softly to attract its attention, Jessica noticed a cloud of dust rising over the hill to the north. Riders, moving fast in their direction. "Matthew," she called, pointing. He turned, his expression darkening as he recognized the approaching threat. "Blackwell's men," he said grimly, quickening his pace toward his horse. "We need to leave now." But it was too late. The riders, 4 of them this time, including the scarred man who'd visited the ranch earlier, crested the hill and spotted them. With whoops that chilled Jessica's blood, they charged down the slope. Matthew reached his horse just as the riders surrounded them. Jessica struggled to her feet, acutely aware of her vulnerability without the pearl-handled revolver, which was back in her cabin. "Well, well," the scarred man drawled, circling them on his horse. "If it ain't Donovan and his auction block bride." "She's not my bride, Silas," Matthew replied evenly, "and you're trespassing on my land." Silas laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Blackwell says this'll all be his land soon enough. Thought we'd come take another look at what we're buying." His gaze shifted to Jessica, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Including the bonus features." Matthew stepped in front of Jessica. "You've had your look. Now get off my property." Another rider dismounted, a burly man with a bushy beard. "Blackwell's tired of waiting for you to see reason, Donovan. Says maybe you need some persuading." Matthew's hand moved to his hip where his gun would normally be holstered, but he'd removed it for the riding lesson, leaving it tied to his saddle. "I'm not selling. Not to Blackwell, not to anyone." "We figured you'd say that," Silas said, also dismounting. So we came prepared to change your mind. What happened next was a blur of violence. The bearded man lunged at Matthew, who sidestepped and landed a solid punch to the man's jaw. But the other two riders had also dismounted, and Matthew was quickly overwhelmed by the 3-against-1 odds. Jessica screamed as they forced Matthew to his knees, his face already bloodied from several blows. Silas drew his gun, pressing it against Matthew's temple. "Here's how this is going to work, Donovan," Silas said coldly. "You're going to sign over your ranch to Mr. Blackwell, or we're going to bury you in it. Your choice." "I'll die before I let Blackwell have this land," Matthew replied, his voice steady despite the blood trickling from his split lip. Silas cocked the hammer of his revolver. "That can be arranged." "No," Jessica cried, lunging forward. "Don't hurt him." Silas turned his attention to her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well now, maybe there's another way to persuade you, Donovan." He nodded to one of the other men. "Grab her." As rough hands seized her arms, Jessica fought with everything she had, kicking and scratching. She connected with the man's shin, eliciting a howl of pain and a backhand across her face that sent her sprawling. Matthew roared with fury, breaking free from his captors momentarily before being subdued again with brutal efficiency. "Touch her again and I'll kill you," he growled, blood staining his teeth. "Big words from a man on his knees," Silas sneered. The sound of a rifle being cocked froze everyone in place. "I'd reconsider if I were you, gentlemen," came a familiar voice. Mrs. Wilkins stood atop the hill, a Winchester repeating rifle balanced steadily in her hands. Behind her were Tom and Hank, both armed and looking grimly determined. "This doesn't concern you, old woman," Silas called, though Jessica noticed his gun hand trembling slightly. "When you attack the man who puts food on my table and threaten a girl under my care, it very much concerns me," Mrs. Wilkins replied calmly. "Now, you boys have exactly 10 seconds to mount up and ride out, or I start putting holes in things. I may be old, but I can still hit a rattlesnake at 50 paces. She raised the rifle to her shoulder. "1." Silas hesitated, looking from Matthew to the armed ranch hands to Mrs. Wilkins, whose weathered finger rested steadily on the trigger. "2." "This ain't over, Donovan," Silas spat, holstering his gun. He mounted his horse, followed quickly by his companions. 3. "Blackwell won't stop," Silas warned as they prepared to ride off. "And we'll remember the warm welcome." His eyes lingered on Jessica with a promise that made her shudder. 4. The riders galloped away, dust billowing in their wake. Mrs. Wilkins lowered the rifle as Tom and Hank rushed to help Matthew to his feet. Jessica hurried to his side, her heart pounding. "How badly are you hurt?" she asked, gently touching his bruised face. "I'll live," Matthew assured her, though he winced as he straightened. "Are you all right? He hit you." Jessica touched her cheek, which was beginning to swell. "It's nothing compared to what they did to you. We need to get you both back to the house," Mrs. Wilkins said practically. "Hank, fetch the doctor from town. Tom, help Mr. Donovan onto his horse." As they made their slow way back to the ranch, Jessica rode with Matthew, supporting him in the saddle. Despite his injuries, his main concern seemed to be for her, his arm protectively around her waist. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I should have protected you better." "You stood against 4 armed men for me," Jessica replied softly. "I'd say you protected me just fine." Back at the ranch, Mrs. Wilkins cleaned and bandaged Matthew's wounds while they waited for the doctor. His injuries, while painful, didn't appear life-threatening. A split lip, a cut above his eye that would likely scar, and ribs that were bruised if not cracked. Jessica's own injury was limited to a bruise on her cheekbone, though Mrs. Wilkins insisted on applying a cold compress to minimize the swelling. "How did you know to come looking for us?" Matthew asked Mrs. Wilkins as she worked. The older woman snorted. "When that mare came back without Miss Jessica and your horse was nowhere to be seen, it didn't take much figuring." "Good thing, too." She tied off a bandage around Matthew's ribs with practiced efficiency. "Those Blackwell boys are bad news, always have been." "This is my fault," Matthew said grimly. "I've put all of you in danger by refusing to sell." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilkins replied sharply. "This is your father's land and his father's before him. Blackwell's just a vulture, circling what he thinks is easy prey." She patted his shoulder. "But we're not as helpless as he thinks." The doctor arrived an hour later, confirming Mrs. Wilkins's assessment of Matthew's injuries and prescribing rest for at least a few days. He also examined Jessica's face, assuring her the bruise would fade without scarring. After the doctor left, Matthew insisted on sitting on the porch despite his injuries. "I need to think," he explained when Jessica protested. "Blackwell won't wait long before trying again." Jessica joined him, bringing a blanket against the evening chill. They sat side by side, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Perhaps you should consider selling," Jessica said quietly. "Not because of the threats, but because it might be safer for you." Matthew looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You think I should give up my family's legacy, everything my father and grandfather built?" "I think your life is worth more than land," Jessica replied. "And I couldn't bear it if—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of how much she cared what happened to this man who'd rescued her from the auction block just a few months earlier. Matthew's expression softened. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, careful to avoid the bruise on her cheek. "Jessica Fuller, are you worried about me?" "Someone has to be," she retorted, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "You're certainly not concerned enough about your own welfare." "That's not true," Matthew said, his hand lingering near her face. "I have plenty to live for." The way he looked at her then, with an intensity that seemed to reach into her very soul, made Jessica's breath catch. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Matthew leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, mindful of his split lip and her bruised cheek, but filled with an emotion that made Jessica's heart race. When they broke apart, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first week you were here," he admitted softly. "Why didn't you?" Jessica asked, equally soft. "Because I wanted you to be sure, to know that you were choosing me, not just grateful to the man who helped you." Matthew pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "I'm still not sure if that's clear." Jessica considered his words, understanding the importance of what he was saying. She'd been vulnerable when they met, desperate for any kindness. But the feelings that had grown over the summer weren't based on gratitude alone. They were founded on respect, admiration, and a deepening affection that she could no longer deny. "Matthew Donovan," she said firmly, "I am grateful for what you did that day in Hot Springs. I always will be, but that's not why I care for you now." She touched his face gently. "I care for you because you're kind without expecting recognition, strong without being cruel, and decent to your core. And because when you smile, really smile, not that polite one you give everyone else, it feels like sunshine after rain." Matthew's expression transformed at her words, his blue eyes brightening even as they filled with emotion. "Jessica," he whispered, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. This time when they kissed, it was Jessica who initiated it, putting all the feelings she couldn't yet name into the gesture. Matthew's arms wrapped around her, drawing her closer, the blanket falling forgotten between them. They might have remained that way for much longer if not for the sound of Mrs. Wilkins clearing her throat as she stepped onto the porch. "Soup's ready," she announced, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Assuming you two still have an appetite for food." Jessica blushed furiously, but Matthew just laughed, the sound warm and genuine despite his injuries. "We'll be right in, Mrs. Wilkins." As the older woman retreated back into the house, Matthew stood carefully, offering Jessica his hand. "We have a lot to talk about," he said, his expression serious once more. "Blackwell, the ranch, the future. But first, I believe I promised Mrs. Wilkins we'd eat her soup." Jessica took his hand, entwining her fingers with his. "Lead the way, Mr. Donovan." That evening marked a turning point in their relationship. The pretense of employer and employee fell away, replaced by an honest acknowledgement of their feelings for each other. They still slept in separate dwellings, Jessica in her cabin, Matthew in the main house, but they spent most of their waking hours together, talking, planning, and occasionally stealing moments for more kisses when Mrs. Wilkins wasn't looking. The threat from Blackwell hung over them like a storm cloud, but Matthew refused to be intimidated into selling the ranch. Instead, he took precautions, hiring 2 more hands to help patrol the property, sending word to the marshal in Hot Springs about the attack, and making sure Jessica was never alone outside the immediate vicinity of the buildings. Jessica continued to practice with the pearl-handled revolver, her aim improving steadily under Matthew's tutelage. She also took to carrying it whenever she left the cabin, a concession to the reality of their situation that she accepted with grim determination. 2 weeks after the attack, with Matthew's visible injuries healing nicely, Jessica was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She tensed, her hand moving automatically to the revolver at her waist, but relaxed when she recognized Matthew's voice greeting the visitor. A moment later, he entered the kitchen with a tall, distinguished-looking man in a black coat and hat. "Jessica, this is Mr. Thomas Harrington from the Arkansas Western Railroad. Mr. Harrington, Miss Jessica Fuller." Jessica wiped her hands on her apron before offering one to the visitor. "A pleasure to meet you, sir." "The pleasure is mine, Miss Fuller," Mr. Harrington replied, removing his hat. "Mr. Donovan speaks very highly of you." "Mr. Harrington has an interesting proposition," Matthew explained, his expression more animated than Jessica had seen it since before the attack. "The railroad is planning a new spur line from Little Rock through Hot Springs, and we're very interested in securing right-of-way access through this region," Mr. Harrington continued. "The Donovan Ranch sits at a critical juncture for our proposed route. I've agreed to sell a narrow corridor along the eastern edge of the property," Matthew said. "At a very favorable price," he added with a smile. Jessica's eyes widened as she grasped the implications. "This would connect the ranch directly to the railroad." "Exactly," Matthew confirmed. "We could ship cattle directly from our own land, cutting out the middlemen and the dangerous drives to the distant railheads. And the payment." He shook his head as if still disbelieving. "It's enough to modernize the entire operation, hire more hands, maybe even expand." Mr. Harrington looked pleased at their enthusiasm. "The railroad values partners like Mr. Donovan, forward-thinking ranchers who understand that progress benefits everyone." After showing Mr. Harrington around the property and finalizing some details of the agreement, Matthew walked the railroad man to his horse. "One more thing, Mr. Donovan," Jessica overheard Mr. Harrington say as she stood on the porch. "I understand James Blackwell has been causing some trouble for you." Matthew's stance stiffened. "News travels fast. Indeed it does. And you might be interested to know that Mr. Blackwell approached us first, offering his land for the right-of-way." Mr. Harrington mounted his horse. "We declined. The railroad has no interest in doing business with a man of his reputation. In fact, I believe his financial situation may be more precarious than is generally known. As Mr. Harrington rode away, Matthew returned to Jessica, a thoughtful expression on his face. Blackwell's in financial trouble, he mused. That explains his increased desperation to acquire this land. Will the railroad deal make things worse with him? Jessica asked worriedly. Matthew shrugged. Possibly. But it also means we're in a stronger position to face whatever he throws at us next. He took Jessica's hands in his. This changes everything, Jess. With the railroad payment, we could rebuild the old North pasture, improve the breeding stock. The ranch could be profitable in ways my father never imagined. Jessica smiled at his enthusiasm, loving the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of the future. It sounds wonderful. There's something else, Matthew said, suddenly serious. He guided her to sit on the porch step beside him. I've been thinking about this for a while now, but the timing never seemed right. Jessica's heart began to beat faster as Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This was my mother's, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. My father gave it to her when they staked their claim on this land. It's not fancy, but it's beautiful, Jessica whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Matthew took a deep breath. Jessica Fuller, when you came into my life, I thought I was helping you. But the truth is, you've helped me more than you could ever know. You've brought light back to this ranch and to my heart. He took the ring from the box. I love you, Jessica. Will you marry me? For a moment, Jessica couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, as a tear slipped down her cheek, she nodded. Yes, she managed finally. Yes, Matthew, I will marry you. Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that spoke of promises and a future brighter than either of them had dared to hope for just months earlier. Their engagement brought a new energy to the ranch. Plans for the wedding were set for October, after the fall cattle sale and before the winter weather set in. Mrs. Wilkins fussed over Jessica like a mother hen, insisting on sewing her a proper wedding dress and planning a feast that would be talked about for years. The ranch hands, too, seemed buoyed by the news, working with renewed vigor on the improvements Matthew had begun planning. The payment from the railroad had already arrived, allowing them to hire additional help and purchase better equipment. Jessica moved her few possessions from the cabin to the main house, though they maintained separate bedrooms until the wedding, a concession to propriety that amused Mrs. Wilkins, but which Matthew insisted upon. Your reputation has suffered enough on my account, he told Jessica one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. I won't have people saying I didn't do right by you. Jessica leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she'd never thought possible after the humiliation of the auction block. I don't care what people say, she murmured. I do, Matthew replied firmly, because you deserve every respect and courtesy. Always have. September brought cooler temperatures and news from town that the railroad surveyors had begun marking the route through the region. It also brought rumors that James Blackwell had been seen in Hot Springs, drinking heavily and making threats against Matthew Donovan. Should we be worried? Jessica asked when Tom brought the news back from his supply run to town. Blackwell's all talk, Tom assured her. Word is, he's losing his ranch to the bank, gambled away most of his money and borrowed against the property. No one's taking his threats seriously. But Matthew wasn't convinced. A desperate man is the most dangerous kind, he said that night as they reviewed the ledgers together. We'll double the night watch until we're sure the threat has passed. His caution proved prescient. 3 nights later, Jessica was awakened by shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. She threw on a robe and rushed outside to find Matthew and the ranch hands battling flames engulfing the barn. "The horses!" Matthew yelled, coughing in the thick smoke. "Get them out!" Jessica ran to help, covering her face with a damp cloth as she entered the burning structure. Together with Hank, she managed to lead the panicked horses to safety while Matthew and the others fought to contain the blaze. By dawn, the barn was a smoldering ruin, but miraculously, no lives had been lost, human or animal. As they surveyed the damage in the gray morning light, the marshal from Hot Springs arrived with 2 deputies. "Got your message about the fire," the marshal said, dismounting heavily. "Any idea who might be responsible?" "Blackwell," Matthew replied without hesitation. "This has his signature all over it," the marshal nodded grimly. "I figured as much. That's why I brought this." He handed Matthew a telegram. "Came in yesterday. Blackwell's been arrested in Little Rock for assaulting a railroad official. Seems he didn't take kindly to being denied a business opportunity." Matthew read the telegram, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. If Blackwell's in jail in Little Rock, he couldn't have set the fire. "Not personally," the marshal agreed, "but he's got men loyal to him. We're looking for Silas Jenkins and the others known to ride with Blackwell." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Silas's scarred face. "Jenkins," the marshal called, his hand moving to his gun. "You're wanted for questioning." Silas's response was a rifle shot that kicked up dirt at the marshal's feet. Chaos erupted as everyone dove for cover. "Jessica, get to the house," Matthew ordered, drawing his revolver, but Jessica had already retrieved the pearl-handled gun from her pocket. "I'm staying with you," she said firmly, positioning herself behind the water trough for cover. What followed was a tense standoff, with Silas firing occasionally from his position on the ridge while the marshal and his deputies returned fire. Matthew managed to work his way around to a flanking position, signaling his intent to the marshal. "Cover me," the marshal instructed his deputies before calling out to Silas again. "Jenkins, you're outgunned. Surrender now." Another shot rang out, this one splintering the wood of the trough inches from Jessica's head. She gasped, ducking lower, her hand steady on her weapon. Suddenly, from Jessica's left, came the sound of a horse at full gallop. One of Silas's companions, the bearded man from the attack in the pasture, was charging directly toward her position, gun drawn. Time seemed to slow as Jessica raised her revolver, remembering Matthew's instructions. "Take a breath. Let half of it out. Squeeze, don't pull." The gun bucked in her hand, the report deafening. The rider jerked, his shot going wild before tumbling from his horse from the ridge. Silas let out a howl of rage. He stood up from his cover, firing wildly toward Jessica. Before he could take proper aim, multiple shots rang out from the marshal, his deputies, and from Matthew, who had worked his way to a position behind Silas. Silas Jenkins fell, his rifle tumbling down the slope ahead of him. In the sudden silence that followed, Jessica remained frozen, the pearl-handled revolver still raised. Matthew was at her side in an instant, gently lowering her arm. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." Jessica looked toward the man she had shot. One of the deputies was examining him. "He's alive," the deputy called, "shot in the shoulder." Relief washed over her, followed by a delayed reaction to the danger. Her hands began to shake. Matthew took the gun from her carefully, then pulled her into his arms. "You were incredible," he murmured against her hair. "My brave Jessica." The marshal and his deputies took the wounded man into custody and recovered Silas's body. Before leaving, the marshal assured them that with Blackwell in jail and his main enforcer dead, the threat to the Donovan ranch was likely over. "Still, I'd keep a watchful eye for a while," he advised Matthew. "Men like Blackwell cast long shadows. In the days that followed, the ranch began to recover from the attack. Plans were drawn up for a new, larger barn to replace the one lost in the fire. The railroad survey team completed their work on the eastern boundary, marking where the tracks would soon be laid. And through it all, Matthew and Jessica grew closer, their shared ordeal strengthening the bond between them. If anything, the confrontation with Blackwell's men had made them more certain of their decision to build a life together. October arrived with clear skies and the earthy scent of autumn. The wedding day dawned bright and crisp, with just enough chill in the air to hint at the winter to come. In the main bedroom of the ranch house, Mrs. Wilkins fussed over the final details of Jessica's appearance. The wedding dress she had sewn was simple but elegant ivory cotton with lace trim and tiny pearl buttons down the back. Jessica's hair was arranged in a loose updo, with sprigs of late-blooming wildflowers woven through the golden strands. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Wilkins said, her usually gruff voice softening with emotion. "Like you belong here. Always have, if you ask me." Jessica smiled, touched by the older woman's words. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins, for everything. You've been like family to me." "Well, after today, I suppose I will be family in a manner of speaking." Mrs. Wilkins adjusted one last flower in Jessica's hair. "There, perfect. Now, I believe there's a very nervous young man waiting for you downstairs." The ceremony was held on the porch of the main house, with the ranch spread out below them like a painting. The local minister had ridden out from Hot Springs to officiate, and the guests included the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and even the marshal and Mr. Harrington from the railroad. But Jessica barely noticed anyone except Matthew, standing tall and handsome in his best suit, his blue eyes never leaving hers as she walked toward him. He had shaved his beard for the occasion, revealing the strong line of his jaw and making him look younger, almost boyish in his happiness. As they exchanged their vows, Jessica felt the last shadows of her past falling away. The humiliation of the auction block, the grief of losing her father, the fear during the attacks, all were overwhelmed by the joy of this moment, standing before the man who had first given her dignity, and now gave her his heart. "I, Matthew, take you, Jessica, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice strong and clear. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Jessica repeated the words, her voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her certainty was absolute. This was where she belonged with this man, on this land that had become her home. "By the power vested in me," the minister concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Matthew's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, sealing their union before God and their assembled friends. As they turned to face their guests, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, a cheer went up from the ranch hands. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with Mrs. Wilkins's feast earning every bit of the praise she'd predicted. There was music from Tom's fiddle, dancing on the packed earth of the yard, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. As twilight fell, Matthew led Jessica away from the festivities and down to the edge of the creek that ran through the property. There, beneath a stand of cottonwoods, he'd prepared a surprise, a small cottage, newly built, that Jessica hadn't even known was under construction. "Our home," Matthew explained, opening the door to reveal a cozy interior, simply but tastefully furnished. "Just for us, at least until we start filling up the main house with children. I thought you might like a place that was ours from the beginning, not just my family's home that you moved into." Jessica explored the cottage with wonder, the main room with its stone fireplace, the small kitchen with shelves for her preserves, and the bedroom with a handcrafted bed frame that she recognized as Matthew's woodworking. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace him. "Absolutely perfect." "There's one more thing," Matthew said, leading her back outside. Behind the cottage was a small garden already prepared for spring planting, and in the center, a blue ribbon tied to a wooden stake. "To remind us both," Matthew said softly, "of how our story began." Jessica touched the ribbon, remembering that day on the auction block when a stranger had offered her dignity when the world had tried to take it away. "I love you, Matthew Donovan," she whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Jessica Donovan," he replied, drawing her into his arms as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Forever and always." That night, as husband and wife, they began their life together in the little cottage by the creek. And in the years that followed, the Donovan ranch prospered beyond what either of them had imagined. The railroad spur was completed the following spring, bringing new opportunities for the ranch. Matthew's innovative approach to cattle breeding gained recognition throughout the territory, and their beef commanded premium prices in markets as far away as Chicago. 2 years after their wedding, Jessica gave birth to their first child, a son they named William, after Matthew's father. He was followed by a daughter, Elizabeth, 18 months later, and eventually by 2 more sons, James and Thomas. The little cottage remained their special retreat, even as the family grew and the main house became their primary residence. Jessica's garden expanded to feed their growing family, and the blue ribbon, replaced whenever it became weathered, continued to mark the center of it, a reminder of how love could bloom from the most unlikely beginnings. James Blackwell died in prison before completing his sentence, his ranch sold at auction to pay his debts. Silas Jenkins's companions, after serving time for the attack on the Donovan ranch, left the territory, never to return. Mrs. Wilkins remained with them until her passing at the age of 78, by which time she had become Grandma Wilkins to the Donovan children, teaching them to bake, sew, and stand up straight just as she had taught their father. In 1900, 25 years after that fateful day at the auction block, Matthew and Jessica celebrated their silver wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and friends. The Donovan Ranch had grown to be one of the most successful operations in Arkansas, and Hot Springs itself had developed into a thriving town, due in no small part to the railroad that Matthew had helped bring to the region. As twilight fell on their anniversary celebration, Matthew found Jessica in her garden, now a lush oasis of flowers, herbs, and vegetables. The blue ribbon, faded but still vibrant, fluttered in the evening breeze. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Jessica leaned back against his chest, her hands covering his. They were both older now, Matthew's hair showing strands of silver, Jessica's figure softened by the years and children, but their love had only deepened with time. "Not one," she replied honestly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, it's all been part of the most beautiful life I could have imagined." Matthew turned her in his arms, his blue eyes still bright and clear in his weathered face. "You know, I've often thought about what might have happened if I hadn't gone into town that day, if I hadn't seen you on that auction block. I believe we would have found each other somehow," Jessica said with quiet certainty. "Some things are simply meant to be." Matthew smiled, that special, genuine smile that, even after 25 years, still made her heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Donovan, I do believe you're right." As the sun set over the land they both loved, Matthew and Jessica walked hand in hand back to their family, their home. and the future they continued to build together, all because of a blue ribbon and a smile that had changed everything.